I can imagine how Jairus felt. As a parent, my worst fear is to lose either of my beloved children to the sting of death. This is something that I believe strongly that no parent should ever have to endure. And yet we know that this horrific tragedy still happens in our fallen world. Peter and I have already lost one child through the devastation of a miscarriage. We know what it feels like to experience great pain and anxiety over the fear of loss. We know what it feels like to hear the words, "I'm sorry, your child is dead. There is nothing more that can be done." And I know that we are not the only people here who have experienced the very painful and the very overwhelming power and reality of death, whether this is through the loss of a beloved relative, a friend, a spouse, or even, God forbid, through the death of a child. And so I can imagine how Jairus felt. He had come overwhelmed by the terrifying turn of events in the life of his family. He came and he fell at the feet of the one who had worked healing miracles before, pleading, begging, "Please, my daughter is dying. Come and lay your hand upon her so that she might be saved and live." And what hope Jairus must have felt when Jesus came, following quickly behind him. Jairus had no doubt heard of other stories of Jesus' amazing healing power, and surely now Jairus, was going to experience this amazing healing power in his own life through the restoration of his daughter, who was now near death. Jesus was coming. He was almost there. It was going to be all right. But then that question, who touched me? And surely Jairus was chiming right in with the disciples. You have to be joking. There's this whole multitude of people are walking around you, pressing in on you. Of course you're going to be touched. Please, please hurry before we're too late. We haven't much time before she might die. But the healer stops. He stops and he tends to someone else. And Jairus has to wait. Anxiety growing, fear increasing, but at this point there's nothing that he can do. And so he waits while Jesus heals this unclean woman. She had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. And as this wraith of a woman pressed through the surrounding crowds, she stumbled often due to her constant state of anemia and the many forms of exhaustion that now plagued her. She thankfully was able to move through the crowds without drawing too much attention to herself. After all, no one really looked at her anymore. It was a welcome change to the hateful and terrified cries of "Unclean, unclean," wherever she went, that had followed her for so long. And she could still hear the uncaring tone of the priest as he recited to her from the Torah. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, for all the days of the discharge, she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Her husband had abandoned her years ago due to her perpetual state of being unclean. Her friends and family had long ago forsaken her due to their own fear of her condition and their wishing not to defile themselves. And had her affliction allowed her to have children, she was sure that they, too, would have disowned her long ago as well. She had not been touched by another living being for 12 years. Except for the physicians, the countless physicians and their cold and hardened touches. Out of hope to end her suffering, she had allowed herself to be subjected to the painful and humiliating methods for a cure. But despite everything that had been done to her body, the bleeding had not stopped. And yet she still had to pay them. All the money to her name was now in the hands of the countless physicians that she had journeyed to over the course of 12 years. She was alone in the world, alone with her suffering. She could not even enter into the synagogue to pray due to her constant state of being unclean. She felt as though the God she had worshipped since childhood had abandoned her the moment that cursed bleeding began. But then, she overheard this story about a man who had once been paralyzed and how he had been healed by a man named Jesus. And the hope that she long thought had also abandoned her began to well up inside of her again. And here he was, today of all days, walking through the streets of her village, and she thought, if only I could just touch his cloak, I will be made well. And now, after making her way through the crowds of people, she was almost there, just a few feet away from him now, and she reached out her frail fingers and touched the fringe of his garment. And she knew in her body at that very instant that her finger touched the fringe, she knew she had been healed. And miracle of miracles, the bleeding had finally stopped. And in her relief and joy, she turned around and she began to look for her best route to slink away in the surrounding crowds. But then that question, who touched me? And her happiness instantly turned to horror. How could he have noticed? Wasn't there a multitude of people walking beside him? How many had touched him before she did? If she stepped forward, would the crowds threaten to stone her for having deliberately touched and defiled a rabbi? Would their anger rise up against her for her having made them unclean by pressing her way through the throng? What would become of her now that she had finally experienced the healing that she had hoped for so long? And then she looked up. And did the one with the healing hem actually meet her gaze? And that look, that was not the look of fear and contempt she had received for so long now. No one had looked at her like that for 12 years. And right then she knew she had to tell him, just as her body had known it had been healed of her affliction. She stepped forward in fear and trembling before the one whose very cloak had the power to heal her, and she told him the truth of her bleeding for 12 years, of the many things the physicians had tried, of the way everyone she had loved had abandoned her, and the hope she felt in seeing him, and the healing she had experienced through the fringe of his garment. And his response was completely different from what she had expected. His tone communicated to her that he spoke to another beloved human being and not simply an unclean eyesore. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." The healer saw it necessary to make this woman known, and he commended her before the crowd. Her humiliation had been public knowledge. Her healing must be public knowledge as well, so that the people would now treat her as one who had been restored to their midst. Rather than rebuking her for not following strict religious regulations, he commended her for her deep faith, exhibited through her boldness and her courage. He gave her hope and a future. No longer was she to remain ostracized and condemned as one unclean, but now she was fully restored to the world of touch and affection, fully restored to health and wholeness, fully restored to the life that God had wished for her. Her faith was the conduit through which Jesus' power could flow to her need. Her faith had made her whole. And all the while, here stood Jairus, watching, waiting, while Jesus healed another. Had Jesus forgotten his tearful pleas while his healing powers were used on this once unclean and outcast woman? If only he would hurry. Then Jairus could witness this amazing healing power again in the life of one much more important and precious to him than this stranger from the crowd. But then he saw one of his servants coming toward him, and his heart stopped, and his breath failed, and his hope died. And he knew what had happened in his soul even before his servant spoke the word, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." It was too late. They had lingered for too long. His daughter had died, robbed of her life at a mere 12 years of age. Only Jesus ignores this version of the truth. And he turns to the grief-stricken man and he says to him, "Do not fear. Only continue to believe, and she will be saved." As if to say, you once had faith in the power of God's healing. Indeed, did you not just witness it in front of your own eyes? And Jesus journeys with Jairus in his grief. He goes with him to his home where the mourners and the wailers have already gathered to mourn the dead. And Jesus says to the crowd, "Do not weep. She is not dead, but sleeping." And Jairus can hardly believe what he heard. He must have misunderstood over the cacophony of the wailing and the shattering of his own heart. If he could have mustered it in the midst of this tragedy, he would have laughed along with the crowd. But Jesus beckons Jairus and his wife and leads them into the room that his daughter's vibrant laughter had once filled. And Jesus lovingly, gently goes to her and touches her body and takes her hand. And Jesus says to his daughter something that Jairus had heard his wife call to her every morning, "Child, get up." And then he knew. At that very instant that Jesus spoke those words, he knew in his heart that his hope had been restored as assuredly as he knew his daughter's life had been restored. Miracle of miracles, he saw his daughter not only sit up and smile at him, but get up and finally eat something after she had been ill for so long. And when the healer asks them not to tell anyone, Jairus thinks to himself, why would I need to say anything when my daughter's very life witnesses to the incredible healing power of God? And one can imagine that even when things did not always go well for Jairus after that day, for nothing always goes exactly as we would hope, that his amazing and life-changing experience inspired him to take to heart Jesus' command to continue to believe for the rest of his days. These two people are models of sincere faith, even in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. One was a synagogue leader, an important figure in the community who had heard of the healing power of Jesus and had the faith to seek him out, who went with Jesus into his home, and whose continued belief allowed him to see the power of God at work in the restored life of his daughter. The other, an outcast woman, thought to be a nobody, whose faith and courage inspired her to risk her entire destiny on Jesus, who trusted him to rescue her from her past and to renew her future. Because of their faith, they are both able to experience the incredible power of God's healing in their lives. And perhaps there are times when you as well have also experienced God's amazing healing in your own life, regardless of the form that this may have taken. But what about those whose faith is strong, and yet they do not experience physical healing for their afflictions? Is God less present in these situations? Is God not at work at these times? Much damage has been done in accusing those who are sick that their faith is simply not strong enough to heal them. Much guilt has been incurred because those who are afflicted fear their faith is not great enough to make them well. Yet where is God when physical healing does not come? During our miscarriage, before we had heard for sure that our baby had stopped developing, there was this certain point in the doctor's office when my heart began to sense that something was wrong. When I stopped praying, oh God, please let our child be okay. And I instead began to pray, oh God, please be present with us. And in many ways, the divine presence continued to be made known with us even when no physical healing came and no life was restored. God's healing was with us through the compassionate embraces of family and friends, through the many hugs and the shared tears and the prayers that we received from sisters and brothers in Christ. This was how we experienced the amazing healing power of Jesus following our miscarriage, even though we still mourn the loss that took place 7 years ago this month. For God's healing occurs in many other ways than simply that of physical healing. When Jesus says to the hemorrhaging woman, "Daughter, your faith has made you well," the Greek literally reads, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." This is a holistic healing, so much more so than simply stopping the flow of her blood. It is a healing in her soul, a restoration to the love and embrace of those around her. It is deliverance from everything that has plagued her and the many emotional scars she incurred. Her faith has made her whole. And we can experience this peace and wholeness through our faith in a God who loves us, even when physical healing does not come. For we have faith that Jesus is Lord. He is still master of the waves, even when they are crashing in around us and all hope seems lost. And the story of Jairus' daughter proclaims to us that Jesus is still master even over death itself. It may not always seem that way, especially when death is so close to us, all around us. But our faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Though we were not there with Jairus to see his little girl raised from the dead, we believe that it is God who has the final victory even over death itself. And perhaps Jesus was on to something when he said that the little girl was merely sleeping. The early church latched on to this image of sleep instead of using words of death. When Stephen, the first Christian martyr, when his body finally succumbed to the stones, the text in Acts says literally that he fell asleep. Paul speaks of Christ's resurrection from the dead as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. This image of sleeping, of one who will again wake up, captured their hope and their assurance that one day everyone who has fallen asleep will hear the voice of the healer calling, "My child, get up." And until that day, we have faith that the healer is still at work in the world. Jesus has proclaimed that healing, restored life, and salvation is an inherent part of who he is and his mission in the world, even if it may challenge or reinterpret long-held religious traditions or cultural taboos. Jesus is deeply concerned with the problems of this world, entering into and working through even situations deemed unclean or hopeless. Jesus is still present with us, even when it seems as though Jesus' care and presence have left us while he tends to another. The healer still welcomes our trembling touch, gently saying to us, "Do not fear, only continue to believe."